start, I would like to give a scenario first. Now, I want you guys to think very, very carefully or critically kapag kayo yung nandun sa position na yun. Now, suppose you're a software engineer and you learn that a nuclear missile is about to launch that might start a war. Now, you have two options. Option 1, you hack the network and stop the launch. Pero, in hacking that network, it's against your professional code of ethics na mag-break sa software system nang walang permission. Plus, it's a form of lying and cheating. Now, in option 2, you let the missile launch and explode pero maraming taong mamamatay. Now, in these two options, kapag winay natin siya, kahit anong piliin natin, there would be consequences. Pero I want you guys to keep your answers para malaman natin kung alin sa dalawa ang magiging kung alin sa dalawa ang mag-a-align sa concept ng deontology. Now, let us distinguish first what is the meaning of deontology. So, deontology is an ethical theory that uses rules to distinguish right from wrong. So, meaning, nadidistinguish ng isang individual sa deontology kung ano yung tama at mali sa pag-a-apply ng mga rules or laws. Like for example, bawal magnakaw, bawal pumatay, ano pa ba? Anything that has to do with law would align in deontology. Now, deontology is very, very simple to apply because you're just following some set of rules or laws. It just requires that people follow the rules and do their duty. Like for example, in a classroom setting, sinabi ng teacher mo, bawal magsalita kapag nagdi-discuss siya. Bawal mag-ingay habang nagdi-discuss siya. Siyempre, as a student, as a good student, you will follow these rules or that rule na sinet ng teacher mo. This approach tends to fit well with our natural intuition about what is or isn't ethical. Despite its strengths, rigidly following deontology can produce results that many people find unacceptable. Kasi nga, sa deontology, hindi nagmamatter kung ano yung magiging consequences ng action or ng decision mo. Ang mahalaga, sumunod ka sa duty, sa obligation, or sa rules na naset or meron sa standard nyo. Or to make it more clear, I'll give you another scenario. For example, ngayong araw na to, nagtitake kayo na exam nyo rather. And yung exam na yon, sobrang hirap niya. Like, out of 39 people, siguro mga 3 students lang yung pumapasa. And yung friend mo, she seems struggling in this subject. And alam mo na kapag nabagsak niya yung exam na yon, mataas ang possibility na matanggalan siya ng scholarship. So, she needs to pass. Basically, she needs to pass the exams. Now, while taking the exam, nakita mo na nagsi-cellphone siya habang nagsasagot. Now, while contemplating, alam mo sa sarili mo na using cellphone during the exam is a form of cheating. As a student, kahit pa kaibigan mo siya, sinabi mo sa professor mo that your friend is using phone or cheating during the examination. Because you follow rules. Gusto mo fair and square lahat. Because you believe that is the rightest thing to do. Now, paano siya naging deontology? Because pinalo mo yung rules without thinking or without considering the consequences of that action. Kasi dahil sinumbong mo siya sa professor nyo, may chance na bumagsak siya sa exam, and also, you can lose your friendship with her. So that's deontology. Following deontology, like what I said, is easy to apply. But it also means, again, disregarding the possible consequences of our actions when determining what is right and what is wrong. So, there are 4 key principles of deontology. Number 1, of course, is duty. So, in deontology, it is concerned with doing what is right because it is the right thing to do, not because it will lead to a good outcome. So, like what I said ng paulit-ulit kanina, in deontology, you are concerned or very strict with following rules, regardless kung ano yung magiging outcome or yung magiging consequences ng action or decision mo na yun. Now, under that is universal rules. Deontologists believe that there are universal moral rules that everyone should follow. And next is universality. In deontologists consider the implications of their actions as if they were universal. And lastly, we have motive. Now, the morality of actions is not determined by their consequences, like what I said, but rather by the motives of the individual performing them.
According to Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, a German philosopher, deontology is an ethical approach centered on rules and professional duties. Deontology derives from the Greek word deon, which refers to that which is binding. The theory's celebrated proponent formulated the most influential form of a secular deontological moral theory in 1788. Unlike religious deontological theories, the rules, or maxim, in Kant's deontological theory derives from human reason. Kant believed that the result is not primary importance, rather, the real importance is in determining the moral intent of a decision or action itself.
In order to fully understand the ethical framework of deontology, here are some of contemporary examples in which deontological concepts can be applied. First, we have the news from 2 weeks ago about a mall guard who was caught on video destroying a girl's sapaguita for sale outside SM Mega Mall. The guard approached her and ordered her to move elsewhere, as she is not allowed to sell inside the mall premises. However, she didn't want to leave, causing the guard to grab and rip the girl's sapaguita garlands. The girl then throws the ruined sapaguita at the guard's face. There were debates on the internet saying that the guard only did his duty, but deontologists would argue that it will be considered as morally wrong. In deontology, Immanuel Kant specifically emphasized the concept of as end in themselves and as means to end. An end in themselves means that every person has an inherent worth and dignity to respect. Ang sinasabi ng deontologists sa Tagalog na ang concept na to, ang bawat isa ay dapat respetuhin at pangalagaan. Bawat tao ay dapat tignan bilang kapantay natin at hindi bilang instrument or way para lang gamitin sa sarili nating interes, or ang sinasabi ni Immanuel Kant na means to end. For example, kinaibigan kita kasi gusto ko at hindi dahil para gamitin ka lang. Now, going back sa example natin, why would deontologists consider it as morally wrong? Despite the mall guard fulfilling his duty, which is prohibiting the unauthorized selling on the mall ground premises, yung pagkaka-execute niya ng duty niya ay mali. As you can see in the video, he kicked the girl disregarding her dignity and violating her right to be respected. Now, looking at the girl's actions, would it be considered morally right or wrong? We can see na yung action niya after sirain ng guard, yung benta niya was because of an injustice. But, deontologists would still agree na yung retaliation of the girl is still morally wrong because it is part of universal rule to treat each other with respect. Now, we have another case example, and this is based on the movie entitled The Trial. Let us first analyze this film. Peter Thomason was accused of murdering his girlfriend, Angela Hightower. Despite having no recollection of the events on the night of the murder, he was still given the opportunity to have legal representation and a fair trial. This sin aligns with the duty of the legal system to uphold justice by conducting a fair trial, which falls under the legal principle of innocent until proven guilty. This principle ensures that no one will be wrongly accused and punished without sufficient and reliable evidence. This legal maxim supports Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, a law or universal law that can be applied without any contradiction to everyone regardless of their desires and circumstances. If the opposite of this legal principle was applied, then it will lead to an unjust legal system, which will now then contradicts Kant's concept. Moreover, it also aligns with Kant's concept of treating humans as ends, not means. As he stated, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. The presumption of justice protects Thomason's dignity from the public demand of justice and sentencing him with the death penalty. However, as the film progresses, statements that would further prove Thomason's innocence are dismissed because of its insufficiency and questionable credibility of the source. This became the major conflict of the film, as the jury sentenced him to death by lethal injection. This particular scene from the film when Peter was sentenced with the death penalty, Deontologists would see this as morally impermissible. Why? If the provided statements are potential truth, the jury should not dismiss it but rather evaluate it instead of focusing on the witness's background. This would contradict Kant's concept of categorical imperative because of invalidating the testimony and not properly assessing the presented evidence. The subjective bias contradicts the concept of treating every individual as ends, not means. The legal system or the jury must examine and evaluate the evidence regardless of its source to prevent irreversible consequences. Now, the next example is the classic trolley problem. A runaway trolley is heading down the tracks toward 5 workers who will all be killed if the trolley proceeds on its present course. You are standing next to a large switch that can divert the trolley onto a different track. The only way to save the lives of the 5 workers is to divert the trolley onto another track that only has 1 worker on it. If you divert the trolley onto the other track, this 1 worker will die, but the other 5 workers will be saved. Of course, many people would choose to sacrifice 1 person to save the other 5, and some will choose to save 1 than the other 5 people. Looking at this scenario from a deontological perspective, we must remember that the whole concept of deontology is focusing solely on the action itself, not the consequence. Let's analyze the options. If you divert the trolley to save 1 worker or the other 5, you are intentionally killing or causing the death of the other workers. Sa perspective ng deontologist, makukonsidered siya as morally wrong. Why? Because you use other people to achieve your goal, which is to save the other worker. This initially violates the concept of respecting the inherent worth of every person. Deontologists would also argue that it is wrong to kill or take someone's lives, regardless of the consequence. If you divert the trolley, you are now responsible. But what if you didn't divert the trolley, you let them die? Deontologists would see this as morally permissible. Why? Because you don't have any responsibility or you are not responsible for the deaths of the worker or workers. This action would fall into the concept of not using someone as means to save others or achieve a goal. That is why there are many criticisms about this ethical framework, as other philosophers viewed this problematic because of its rigidity.
Hello everyone, my name is Lokmo Crystal Deboise. I'm here to talk about Immanuel Kant ethics, I will give you the strength, weakness, and critique of Immanuel Kant's ethics. Let's start by the strength. The first strength is the universal moral. Kantian categorical imperative ensure consistencies by requiring short moral principle be applicable universally. This provides clear guidance for ethic decision making and prevents subjective bias. The second strength is respect for human dignity. Kant emphasized on treating individuals as ends in themselves, not merely as means to an end, underscore the intrinsic worth of every person. This has been foundational for human rights discourse. The third strength is moral responsibility. By focusing on duty rather than outcome, Kantian ethics holds individuals accountable for their action regardless of external circumstances. The fourth strength is clarity in ethical principle. A categorical imperative provides a straightforward test for moral action. If an action cannot be universalized, it is morally impermissible. The third strength is objectivity and rationality. Kantian ethics is rooted in reason, offering an objective framework that does not depend on emotion or personal preference, making it impartial and fair. Let's talk about the weakness. The first weakness is rigidity. Kantian ethics often disregard the consequence of action. Critics argue this rigidity can lead to morally problematic outcomes such as prioritizing adherence to rules over compassion and practical consideration. The second weakness is conflict of duty. Deontology struggle with situations where duty conflicts. For example, if lying is always wrong, how should one act when lying could save an innocent life? The third weakness is lack of practicality. The universalizability principle can be difficult to apply in complex real-world scenario, determining whether a maxim is truly universalizable can be subjective. Now, let's talk about the critique of Kantian ethics. The first critique is utilitarian critics. Utilitarian argue that Kant's dismissal of consequence is misguided. According to them, the morality of an action should depend on its outcome, especially if adhering to a rule causes unnecessary harm or suffering. They also criticize the rigidity of universal maxims, suggesting that moral flexibility is often required to maximize overall well-being. Existentialist critics like Nietzsche criticizes Kant's ethics as overly abstract and disconnected from human vitality and individual creativity. He views Kantian morality as life denial and overly concern with universal rule and the expense of personal freedom. We have also critics of Sartre. Sartre question whether universal rule could capture the nuance of personal moral dilemma, emphasizing individual responsibility and choice over fixed principle.
So now, let's explore deontology and its contrast with other ethical theories. So, deontology is an ethical philosophy rooted in duty and rules. So, deontology is an ethical rooted in duty and rules. So, first, let's examine deontology versus utilitarianism. So, utilitarianism focuses on outcomes. It aims to maximize happiness and minimize suffering for the greatest number of people, which is actions are judged based on their consequences. However, deontology focuses on the morality of actions themselves, whether they align with duties and principles. So now, consider deontology versus virtue ethics. Virtue ethics emphasizes building good character traits like honesty and courage over following rules. It is about being a virtuous person rather than doing specific duties. For example, helping a stranger in need, a virtuous person might do so because it reflects their character, while a deontologist might help because they see it as their moral obligation. So now, how about deontology versus divine command theory? Divine command theory asserts the morality comes from God's commands. Actions are right if God commands them and wrong if God forbids them. Deontology, while it can align with religious principles, does not rely on a divine source. It focuses instead on universal duties and principles. Deontology versus natural law theory highlights another distinction. Natural law theory, rooted in thinkers like Aristotle and Aquinas, which sees morality as tied to universal natural laws. These guide humans' behavior toward fulfilling natural purposes. Deontology, by contrast, isn't based on fulfilling natural purposes, but on adhering to moral rules. Like killing, for instance, natural law theory argues it is wrong because it violates the natural law of preserving life. Deontology says it is wrong because it violates respect for human life.
Now, we understand how deontology can be applied in different scenarios. We also saw its strengths and weaknesses and its concepts, emphasizing the importance of seeing the inherent worth of every individual. Deontology is a very influential ethical framework as it is rooted in duty-based principles or moral rules. However, it is also important to examine its limitations or complexity.